Welcome to this second session in a four-part series on engaging the university. I'm Terry Halliday, and I'm an academic sociologist at an Institute of Advanced Studies on Law and Social Science in Chicago. I'm also a faculty volunteer with the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students. In our last session, we talked about two premises about our role in the university. We first of all stated that God is everywhere in the university, in the libraries, in the laboratories, in the seminar rooms, wherever we gather and wherever we debate and discuss and do research in the university, wherever truth is discovered, wherever justice is being advanced, wherever beauty is being created, God is there. And the second premise we talked about is that God has given us a rare calling to serve him in the university. The university is a unique site for mission. It's a generator of knowledge. It's a critical center for what's going on in the world. It transmits learning. It's an inculcator of thinking and perhaps moral and ethical skills. In many societies, it's a protected space where things can be said and debated that cannot be done outside the walls of the university. The university is also integral to most every society, to its leadership, its policy directions, and its moral fabric. And we talked in our last session about the calling we have to be salt, to be light, and to develop our individual talents. We also discussed one academic's spiritual autobiography. This was a story of one call to pursue an academic career as a Christian. The unfolding of a life which involved discoveries and breakthroughs, but it was also a life story that had failures and shortcomings, most particularly the struggle over spiritual schizophrenia, dividing the life of faith from the life of scholarship, and moving from there to the integration of faith and learning. And so the story concluded with a celebration that we are called to serve in the university, and in so doing, we are called to integrate our faith and our scholarship, to learn to think Christianly about whatever it is we are doing. Now, the next question, which is an excellent question, a question with which we all wrestle, is how do we do this? How do we integrate faith and learning? How do we develop a Christian mind? And so now I offer you a third premise, and that is that we are to bring Christian meaning to the university. You recall that wonderful story of Jesus on the Emmaus Road in Luke 24. Here were two men who were steeped in the Hebrew Bible. They'd been in Jerusalem and they'd seen all the events that had surrounded Jesus' crucifixion. They were expecting to see the crowning of a Messiah, and now they are walking away from Jerusalem thinking they've only seen a great prophet crucified. And they are absolutely puzzled. They cannot understand what they have seen. They knew their Bible, but they didn't know how to attribute meaning to the events in Jerusalem in the last few days. And then Jesus appears and walks with them and starts a conversation, a dialogue. He opens up to them a two-way conversation about what they had seen and what meaning that has for him. Essentially, he was saying that these events require for them a new and a fresh rereading of Scripture. Jesus revealed to them the layers of meaning, new challenges of interpretation, new ways to rightly divide the word of truth, new ways to theologically and holistically think about all the learning they had from the Old Testament. Essentially, Jesus said to them, you need to reinterpret your Bible in the light of the events that you've just seen and the meaning that I am now giving to you. And what was the result? We have that wonderful passage, quote, their hearts glowed within them. We therefore bring Christian meaning to the university through conversation and through dialogue. So conversations in the university can stimulate exactly that kind of rereading of the Bible and I would say also a rereading of our disciplines. So let me first of all provide an overview of what we'll talk about today. We'll discuss what is a conversation and what it is not. We'll think a little bit about why we're conversing, and then we'll talk about the kinds of conversations we can have in the university. We'll think about who are our conversation partners, and then we'll discuss the idea that conversations are a way that we as Christians can develop our virtues in the university context. So let's begin with this first question. What is a conversation? In the first place, it's an exchange. There are two people going back and forth. And in that exchange, there will be an expression of inquisitiveness. I ask you something, and you ask me something. And we go back and forth in a series of clarifying questions of response and re-response. Sometimes that back and forth and the conversation will involve an expression of wonder. I'm amazed about what you're doing. You're amazed that I could be interested in this particular topic. Moreover, frequently in the process, it is a relationship building experience. It's a way of bridging divides. This was certainly the case with Jesus and the two men on the Emmaus Road. As we talk together, we are not simply expressing words and articulating sentences, we're actually building a relationship of mutual discovery. Sometimes it can be a negotiation of getting to common ground, where there has been some kind of tremendous outburst or conflict or crisis in our society. And we can then be thinking about ways that we can talk to other people that are potential resolutions of how that crisis might proceed. They can also be a prelude to action. For example, in the current situation, should I or how should I be holding the President of the United States accountable for his failure to manage the COVID-19 pandemic in my country? Or the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, how do we hold him accountable for his persecution of Tibetan Buddhists and the Muslims in Xinjiang province, or Christians all over China? But we should also be reminding ourselves of what a conversation is not. Now, we academics like to give lectures. We like to engage in a monologue where we have many students sitting in front of us, and we speak to a passive audience, and they are supposed to gratefully take down all that we say in order to be able to regurgitate it back to us. But a conversation is not a lecture. Actually, a conversation is not a debate either. We're not in the process of fighting for points, for me triumphing over you or you triumphing over me, though of course there's obviously places for debate in the university context as there is for a lecture. Neither is a conversation a diatribe. We see the diatribes that the prophets, for example, level at the rulers of ancient Israel. And perhaps there is a place for denunciation in the university, but a conversation is not a denunciation. Well, why are we engaging in this conversation? One answer is to bring new meaning to old understandings. We're engaging in conversations because this is a way that the university can deepen my humanity, can enrich my faith life. How? Well, if God is everywhere in the university, then God can speak to me through every aspect of university life. Let's start with this radical presumption. After all, we have a radical faith that everything studied in the university can deepen our understanding of God, or of God's working in the world, or of God's general and special revelation, or of God's grace and the workings of common grace. In other words, God has put me in the university to enrich me, to enrich my faith, to build up my ministry, but also for the university to do that to me. And so I can engage in conversations in my discipline and across disciplines because I'm curious. There's mystery throughout the Bible, and there is mystery in the university. As we see our faith through a glass darkly, as Paul says, so we also see mysteries in the university, somewhat through a glass darkly. We engage in conversations in the university because we know that ideas matter. Christians say every person is made in the image of God, the doctrine of Imago Dei. What does that mean? What is the significance of these racial divisions that people are constantly engaged in between whites and blacks and people of brown skin and albino skin? What are these struggles about between slum dwellers and aristocrats, between dictators and starving children? The university deepens my humanity because it brings me into contact with a center of creativity, where there's a great deal of cross-fertilization. Why are we conversing? We're also conversing not simply to enrich my faith, we're conversing to enrich the university itself for the purposes of the kingdom of God. Because in a conversation, we can engage in a gentle way of conveying the love of God, of caring about what the university cares about, of being animated and excited about the university's endeavors, about what's troubling other people, about offering intellectual empathy to others in a university context. We're conversing and enriching the university by bringing the love and the compassion of Christ through the stands that we take, through the practical activities that we engage in the university. We're also enriching the university because we're affirming what the university should stand for. It should stand for a search for truth. It should stand for the celebration of beauty. It should stand for an understanding of justice. We're also conversing because we can enrich and help enrich the university for the university's own purposes. The university is supposed to be a place where curiosity is cultivated in each of us. It's supposed to be a place that celebrates creativity in every experiment, in every new piece of writing that goes on in the university. It's a place where we as Christians can leaven the criticism that often is the bane of a university existence. We can bring to the university theological and ethical dimensions on the big issues of the university. And as a result, we as Christians can become valuable for the university as an institution and the purposes of the university. What are the sorts of conversations that we can have that will stimulate and advance those purposes? Well, today we're talking about conversations in our disciplines. And so this is a key place to start with disciplinary issues, whether our disciplines are in the social sciences or the natural sciences, whether they're in applied fields like law or medicine, whether they're in literature or history or the fine arts or public policy. In every one of these disciplines, we can provide and bring through conversation something of the new kind of meaning that Jesus brought to those men on the Emmaus Road. On disciplinary issues, for example, we should be asking the question, what are the big questions of the field? So you know that I'm a sociologist of law. And so a big question for somebody like me who studies law and globalization is who makes global laws and norms and standards for the whole world? And how do these spread across the world? There's a vast amount of research on all continents about these questions. But once we know that question as a key question, then how can I, as a Christian, begin to think about that question and contribute to the answering of those questions? In our disciplines, we can be asking, what are key assumptions on which this discipline rests? And once we know the answer to that question, we can ask, are these key assumptions consistent with the key beliefs that we Christians have? We can also be asking about our discipline, what are the discipline's limits? And this is actually a rather crucial issue. A distinguished professor of materials science at Oxford University, professor of nanotechnology, has written a wonderful book with an artist entitled The Penultimate Question. And this scholar, Andrew Briggs, shows that from prehistoric times to the present, science is always, as he said, says, in the slipstream of ultimate meaning. It can answer many wonderful questions, but it cannot answer the ultimate questions about life itself. So a lot of scholarship is about crossing frontiers, and that's part of its richness. But some disciplines are like invading powers. Economics, for example, in my field, would like to be able to colonize part of sociology, or would like to be able to colonize part of law. So some of the conversations we can enter in the university are, what are those limits? Cross-disciplinary topics are another sphere of conversation that are crucial because it also carries us away from the narrowness of our particular disciplinary perspectives. And this is one of the reasons that I love interdisciplinary research. Take the topic of globalization, for example. A big question there is, what are the mechanisms of diffusion by which ideas or laws or capital gets moved across the world? And obviously, what are the types of adaptation or resistance or exploitation that result? How do we balance global governance on the one side with state sovereign rights on the other? These are questions that can be asked by political scientists and sociologists and law professors and economists across a very broad front, historians and scholars in literature as well. Or take climate change. This is not simply a province for the hard sciences. A Christian political scientist who is part of our faculty initiative from New Zealand states that one of his key research problems is, how are we going to deal in the next 50 or 100 years with the hundreds of millions of people who are living at sea level, people, for example, at the Delta in Bangladesh, who are going to need to be moved, relocated somewhere else. Where are they going to be removed to? How are they going to be removed? How can governments manage this kind of massive shift of populations? This is a big cross-disciplinary question. Or what about the impacts of religion? Its impacts on architecture, or on the sciences, or on public health, or on government, or on human flourishing. We can think too about race, which is a big issue at the moment in the United States, yet again. Why is its impact so tenacious? Here we are in the United States, 150 years after the emancipation of slaves, after the American Civil War, and still we have not managed to eliminate discrimination. Still, we have not managed to bring racial equality. These are the kinds of conversations that we need to be entering into, not only as sociologists or historians, or people in race studies, but as Christians. We could talk more about student concerns and local university concerns, and some of those may come up in our next session. But let's just think for a moment about societal issues, the societal issues to which our disciplines speak, or that affect our disciplines, and some of them we've just mentioned now. One of the things that I've really appreciated about the Delhi Summer Institute is a session that they had a few years ago on a topic they called the idea of India. They posed this really fundamental question. What is India? What does it stand for? What does India value? What place does it have on the Asia subcontinent, and should it have? What place does it have in the wider world of geopolitics and economics? Or take the societal issue of gender discrimination, which again is everywhere. Why is it everywhere? Why is it so ubiquitous? Is it fair? Is it just? Or what would an acceptable understanding of gender and practice of gender relations look like? Or think of the societal issue of the protection of indigenous peoples. Again, the problem is everywhere, in North America and Canada and the United States, in Latin America and Brazil, in Africa, in South Asia, in Australia, in New Zealand, places where I've lived. Time and time again, these conversations are going on across disciplinary boundaries, speaking to big issues in society. In all of these conversations, we as Christians can have something to say, and surely we have much to think about. Who are our partners in these conversations? Well, I want to suggest to you that, first of all, the easiest place to start is with our student Christian friends or other friends who may not be Christians. Let's get into the habit of entering into conversations with others about not what we're doing or who we are or what we're interested in, but what are they interested in? What issues excite them? What are they troubled about? And how do they think about those issues? In fact, how do they think Christians should be thinking about those issues? And that's an excellent question to ask people who are not Christians. Another potential set of conversation partners are Christian faculty. In many universities across the world, there are opportunities that I think are often not taken for us to invite Christian faculty into conversations, either one-on-one or in our student groups, where we enter into conversation with faculty members and we ask them, what are they working on? What are they thinking about? What are the wider issues that they're grappling with? And how are they at this moment as Christians thinking about those issues? Asking those questions can be very good for us as students or as faculty colleagues, but they can also be very good for the person who is receiving the questions. As I mentioned in my last session, having a group of Christian professors and theologians asking me questions about my research, questions for which I frequently did not have an answer, was extremely valuable in pushing me forward in my thinking about how to develop a Christian mind in sociology and on law and globalization. But of course, we can also speak to other faculty who are not Christians or not even religious. What do they have to say about an issue? I actually think one of the most interesting questions with faculty who are sympathetic or empathetic in their style is to ask non-Christian faculty, what do they think that religious people, or indeed Christians, should be thinking about a given topic? They can tell us what they think about it, but what do they think we should be thinking about? That can be a very telling and a very constructive conversation, especially if we are humble in the way in which we go about it. A student group in Sierra Leone had a brilliant idea of inviting a non-Christian professor along to speak to their Christian group. This professor was a person who had personal difficulties. Apparently he was an alcoholic and was often disregarded and disrespected by other faculty. But these Christians were studying, the Christian students were studying the idea of leadership, and they decided to invite this non-Christian person along to their group to talk to them about what he thought was the nature of leadership. And that turned out to be a wonderfully productive conversation. He took it very seriously. He actually went to the Bible to discover if there's anything in the Bible about leadership, which of course there is a vast amount. And so there opened up a very positive, constructive, mutually respectful conversation between these students and the professor. Other Christian groups other campus groups are often a very good way for Christian groups to enter into group conversations. Sometimes, for example, when I am giving presentations of my research to a Christian group on a university campus, as I did recently to a law school, I invite not only the Christian group to come, but in this case, I was talking about human rights in China, so I invited human rights groups to come. And I invited East Asian groups of students to come. So there were 3 or 4 different kinds of groups in the session. Only one of those groups was Christian, and this led to a much broader and a much more interesting conversation than if it had only been between me and the Christian students who were there. And then finally, there is the possibility of having conversations with university administrators. And perhaps we can get into this in the next session, and a wonderful provocation that an African woman administrator from a university in Nairobi in Kenya presented to us in Africa a few years ago. Let me conclude today by talking for a moment about Christian conversation as a Christian virtue. Because to sustain a conversation cultivates and is enabled by Christian virtues. So the conversation in itself we can think of as a place where character development can occur, as well as our intellectual development that I'll talk more about in the next session. When I'm in a conversation with another person, with that conversation partner, I am in the process of conveying or learning humility, because essentially I am saying to that person, in asking a question, I don't know something. I want to learn from you. And at the same time, I can be exuding encouragement, because I'm saying to that person, you know something that I don't know. So in that way, I'm affirming your knowledge. I'm affirming your insight and your learning. And as many of us know who have engaged in difficult conversations, especially with somebody in an area who's dealing with topics that are way outside our epistemologies or methods, it requires patience. I may be thinking to myself, this conversation isn't easy. It may be annoying. It may be frustrating. The other person may be engaging in sort of this classic academic pathology we talked about before of monologues. And therefore, I get to develop and test my patience. And then it can be cultivating a mutuality. I'm listening to you and seeking to understand what excites you. I'm hoping that this will also inspire you to listen to me. And finally, there is mutual respect. Implicitly in a conversation that where I'm asking you questions, I am conveying the message that I honor you, your interests, your excitement. In effect, my questions, my listening, my time is endowing dignity on my conversation partner. And so in these ways, conversations may be a proving ground for the cultivation of godliness. Let me conclude by saying then, in our university life, may we model our lives on Jesus and his walk and conversation on the Emmaus Road. May we help ourselves as well as others see a new meaning in their studies and their work, a wonderful meaning, a transcendental meaning, indeed a meaning that may be transformational for them, for us, and for the university as a whole. Thank you, and God bless you.